Hello, thanks for being in a new video. This time I have a full review of the Nubia Z60 Ultra. Let's get started. This is a flagship device, although its price is not as high as we are used to in the flagship market. So that is why it is so attractive. The launch price of this device in Mexico is 12,499 pesos. That's approximately $740. Although remember that the prices here are not the same as over there, and the exchange rate could also vary. But for this price, it is undoubtedly a very attractive option, especially for those who are more interested in photography, since the photographic system of this device looks very powerful, although later we will see a deeper and more detailed analysis. For now, I anticipate you that price I gave you is for the version with the 8GB RAM and the 256GB storage. But there are also editions with the 12GB RAM and also edition with the 500GB RAM storage at higher prices. But definitely in this price range, it gets to compete against devices that are going to offer a much weaker photographic section, so it can excel a lot in that aspect. Still remember that a cell phone is more than its cameras, so we are going to analyze absolutely everything about it for you to decide if it is what you are looking for or not. Currently in Mexico, you could buy it through Nubia's official website or through Mercado Libre, so its sale is exclusively online, and that could be a disadvantage for those who are not used to buying through these means. Now join me to know everything about it. From the front of the device, we begin to notice that it is a high-end device that draws too much attention. Note that also draw attention to its straight finishes on the corners, very similar to what we see in Galaxy S24 Ultra. In addition, we are going to find the camera below the screen, and that is another of its attractive points since the screen has no interruption, although it could be counterproductive for the quality of selfies that we will see later. But for now, you should see that the bezels are super thin, and that's why the front design is so aesthetically appealing. Although in terms of resistance, it is not so attractive because it does not seem to have some level of Gorilla Glass protection. On the right side, we have the volume buttons, the power button with texture, and a black highlight. And note that we also have a switch in the style of Red Magic. Remember that Nubia is family of Red Magic, but in this case, instead of being a switch to activate the game mode, it is actually a switch to enter directly to the camera. So it is convenient. We will see later what you can configure with it. On the top, it has a microphone and also the infrared to work as a universal remote control. Although curiously, it doesn't include a pre-installed system app for remote control, so I installed an external one from Play Store, which is going to ask me to pay if I want to remove ads, but it did work. So it's a bit weird that Nubia doesn't decide to include an app to give more convenience to the user and take advantage of this sensor that it puts on the top. The left side is completely clean and serves to give you a look at the straight frames that includes, and also to tell you that it has a thickness of 8.78 millimeters in its thinnest part. But notice that the camera module comes to protrude in a very important way. So it really is a device that does feel a little bit thick and heavy, especially since it reaches a weight of 246 grams. So it's one of the heaviest devices on the market, but this is because of its large battery and its entire photographic system. At the bottom, note that there is the tray to place 2 nano SIM cards. There is also placed a microphone, then will be placed the USB-C port, and then the speaker grill, and finally another microphone. In this case, I have the edition in black color, but it is also available in silver color, and as you realize, this back cover is completely matte, very pleasant also to the touch, and the attractive of its photographic system is definitely the red ring that gives it a very nice touch. Although, honestly, I do not end up liking much the design in terms of aesthetics, but there, it depends on the taste of each person. What you should also know is that it does have IP68 certification, so if you happen to drop it in the water, it has a very high chance of surviving. Simply, as always, remember that no brand makes valid the warranty for water damage, so if you get to immerse it in the pool water or sea, definitely do it for short periods of time and not too deep, and then rinse it with pure water to avoid deterioration of the protection, since this certification is obtained with tests in pure water, so it is not recommended to introduce it voluntarily in other water, but if you get to do it, rinse it well. The screen is excellent, 6.8 inches with 20:9 ratio, and its resolution is slightly beyond Full HD, that is 2480 by 1116 pixels. Some already call it Quad HD, but it is a resolution that is not so common. What you should know is that it reaches 400 pixels per inch, so it has a good level of detail and good sharpness, both in multimedia content and obviously when displaying text, even with small fonts. The resolution of this screen is AMOLED, as it could not be otherwise, so it is going to offer us also good viewing angles, intense colors, very high contrast also when viewing all this content, and what I mentioned a moment ago, Advantage, which has no clipping on the screen, so you can enjoy a fully immersive experience. This screen reaches a peak brightness of 1500 nits when you are viewing HDR content, and the minimum brightness is also going to be comfortable to use this device in low light conditions without it getting to hurt you, although honestly it does not go down as much as if I have seen it in some other devices. It will also have several modes of use on screen, as dark mode, a reading mode, night light, and even also has some different modes of color calibration for you to choose the mode you like, whether you want more saturated colors or a little less saturated, or even also set the color temperature of the screen. And finally, remember that it is a screen that offers us 120 Hz in its refresh rate. In this case, it is able to vary between 60 and 120 if you choose the automatic setting, which is ideal for having a good power consumption balanced with a very good fluidity when moving in the system animations. So it's a screen that everywhere you look it's good. I have no complaints about it. The device incorporates two speakers. The main one is at the bottom and is the one that will offer us a greater presence of bass frequencies, and the secondary one will be in the area of the earpiece for calls. The truth is that the stereo sound experience is positive, and with respect to the sound quality that is able to offer us, I do not think it is the most remarkable. I feel that the volume is indeed very high, but it stands out too much in mid-frequencies, and I feel that it can become a bit annoying at the highest volume. But what do you say we listen to a small test, although remember it's not the same listening to it live. Fortunately, at the software level, it comes very well complemented, because observe how it offers us the DTS sound options where we could select some specific headphone style. But what I like the most is that it has some sound presets compatible with the speakers, and in fact, it allows us to have a specific equalization in the speakers and not only in the headphones. So, from my point of view, with this equalization, it sounds a little better, and with that, it would correct that little detail that it stands out a lot in mid-frequencies. So definitely, the sound experience seems to me to be totally good in this sense. Although it should be noted that it has no headphone jack, so you will have to use headphones via USB-C or wireless headphones. And in the case of wireless headphones, in addition to the SBC and AAC codec, supports the aptX codec and also aptX adaptive. So we have a good audio resolution with compatible headphones, so you are not forced to use wired headphones if you want to enjoy a good audio experience through headphones. Next, you are going to listen to a test of the 3 microphones that it incorporates so that we can more or less notice the audio quality that they are capable of capturing.
Esta es una prueba de audio captado con los micrófonos integrados de este dispositivo llamado Nubia Z60 Ultra.
Next, we are going to listen to a test of these microphones in an environment of a much higher volume, putting the sound system of my room at maximum volume to try to notice if the audio is distorted in this type of conditions. And as most devices seem to have no distortion even in these very high sound environments, so the experience will be positive when recording sound with this device. The front camera is below the screen, so it is not so easy to show it, although in some light angles if you could get to see it somehow. This camera is 12 megapixels with f2 0-point aperture and autofocus. The specs don't look bad, but the fact that it's underneath the screen can complicate things a lot. To quickly open the camera, I already anticipated you that we have a switch in this part with what we can access very quickly to this camera. However, note that opens immediately in scene mode, so to go to selfie you must switch to photo and then you can press the button to rotate. Note that the capture speed in selfie is quite slow, so if you want to take continuous photos, this is not the device, as it takes a long time processing to try to optimize the image and improve the result because the camera is behind the screen. But it also has beauty options with a single slider in case you want to enhance the face, and at the top it allows you to enable some filters that you can preview in real time. And even though this is a photography phone, selfies are actually going to disappoint a bit too much. Of course, the result is amazing considering that the camera is under the screen, but I don't think it's ideal to put a camera of this style on a dedicated photography device, as these selfies won't come out with a good level of detail. They will be very simple, and in this case, we are in a good light condition. It also doesn't have a lot of range, and color rendition is honestly not going to be accurate. If you are close to the camera, you might be able to recover a little more detail, but due to the algorithm that tries to improve the photo to avoid the cloudy effect that is left by being behind the screen, sometimes the detail can look very artificial. Backlit, it does not have an optimized preview, but after taking the picture it balances the lights and shadows more or less well, but here the detail is the effect that is created in the contours due to the camera being below the screen. Notice how all the edges of the objects that are in shadows will come out with a kind of halo that is definitely not nice, so the pictures come out very ugly in this kind of conditions. Indoors is where the camera can behave better, although anyway notice that there is much more noise present than we would like and we don't see such a high level of detail either. And at night we will again notice a slightly strange effect. Notice how there are some areas where it looks like there are spots on the face, some areas with higher saturation and some areas with very little saturation. So definitely the photography with the front camera is very bad. Even notice how in this case again there is a kind of ghosting effect in some areas. And in more complicated scenes it is definitely not able to do a good job, not even using the screen as a flash simulation. Although this is much more complicated, but anyway, in a device focused on photography one would expect a better result. And note how even though it is capable of taking portrait photography blurring the background, again we will notice a rather strange effect, especially if you have some backlight projecting even the colors of the pixels, giving a very unpleasant result. During the day, also the portraits will look very bad, with very little level of detail and without the possibility to keep in focus the objects in the foreground. So the front camera definitely disappoints. I would have preferred the screen to have a cutout in exchange for having a higher quality front camera. But I also understand that there may be people interested in photography who don't care about the front camera and prefer an all-screen experience. It's up to you as a user which you prefer. Now pay close attention because we are going to describe this whole photographic system that despite being 3 cameras, they are actually multiplied thanks to cutouts applied to the sensor. So let's start with the 18mm ultra-wide camera. It's not the widest on the market, so take that into consideration, but it offers us a high-resolution sensor with 50 megapixels and the lens has f1.8 aperture autofocus and also has optical stabilization, which is quite rare in an ultra-wide camera. Generally, no manufacturer includes optical stabilization in this camera, so from this camera it already starts to stand out very much as a strong point. Then, applying a crop on this same camera, it can offer us the 24mm angle, considered as the main camera in most devices. In this case, the main camera is 35mm. That is, it is a little closer than what we usually find in the main camera of other smartphones. So it will offer us an angle, shall we say, unique. It also offers us 50 megapixels. So it's another high-resolution sensor, and in this case, it offers us an f1.59 aperture. It's an extremely bright lens with autofocus and optical stabilization. And by applying a crop on this sensor, it can give us a 50mm capture, which for most smartphones would be a 2x zoom, although in this cell phone it does not strictly represent 2x, but it retains the same characteristics of this lens. And finally, we have the 85mm lens, which for most cell phones would be a 3.5x optical zoom. But in this case, again, since the main camera is 35mm, it will not really seem to have too much zoom, but looking specifically at the optics, it is quite good. In this case, it gives us 64 megapixels, so again, we see a high-resolution sensor, and in this case, it has f3.3 aperture, autofocus, and optical stabilization. And if you thought that was all, you are wrong, because having high-resolution sensor, again, they make a crop to give us a capture of about 170mm while maintaining optical quality. For this cell phone, it would be a 5x zoom, but for other cell phones, it would be a 7x zoom approximately, and the pictures would be 16 megapixels. So, as you can see, by having 3 high-resolution sensors, it can offer cropping within the sensors to give us optical quality at multiple focal lengths. It really is a super professional photographic system. Next, we are going to do a test shot to try to capture number 3 and see how fast the capture speed can be. Let's do a second shot to be absolutely sure we have done a correct test and verify what I'm telling you. As you can see, it seems to take a little longer, about a quarter of a second after I press the shutter. So in these kind of fast shots, I think it's not going to stand out too much. But notice that the device is also going to give us a burst that's going to be virtually unlimited with lots and lots of pictures, with a very good capture speed between one photo and another, but the burst takes about a second to react. So you might miss the exact moment if you need a specific shot. I think it confirms that this device, despite offering us a good photo quality, doesn't seem to be able to offer us a capture at the exact moment. At the top, we have the control of the saturation of the photographs, if we want a natural tone or we want a much more intense tone. I tested the camera with the default settings. Also notice that we can access the same list of color filters that we saw on the front camera. If we tap on screen, we can adjust the focus and also the exposure, but if we want more advanced controls, we can access the expert mode. And notice how it has all kinds of parameters. The ISO can go up to 25,600, something definitely spectacular considering what we normally see in the smartphone market. The shutter speed can even go up to 5 minutes, also giving us an extremely advanced capture, something we don't usually see in cell phones. We also have control of white balance, focus, exposure compensation, and more parameters. Of course, we can also get to lock the focus or white balance. We also have a histogram available and raw photography appears as well. That's why I tell you that this device is very attractive for photographers, because it gives us a lot of manual settings. And if you take the photos in raw, you can do a much more advanced post-processing. And notice how even though you only have the 3 buttons for the 3 different lenses, you can press a second time on the same button and it's going to change its focal length. You know, the 18mm camera is able to give you a 24mm photograph as well by applying a crop, and the 35mm camera is able to give you a 50mm crop, and finally the 85mm can also give you 170 as I mentioned a moment ago. But back to the smartphone experience. Notice that when you focus on a document, it's going to give you the suggestion to enter this special mode. It will automatically do the cropping for you to make it easy to scan, although it does not offer any type of filter or improvement to give more sharpness to the text, and in this case with respect to scanning QR codes, it cannot be done from the main camera interface, but it does have a shortcut to Google Lens next to the shutter. With Google Lens, you could already perform this action, but it is definitely an additional step that, from my point of view, should be integrated directly into the camera interface. All 3 cameras will have high-resolution sensors, and here we are seeing the first of the high-resolution results. It's 50 megapixels, and I honestly feel like I could take better advantage of this level of detail, because there are some areas that I feel are even a little bit out of focus. The truth seems to me a little strange result. But in some areas, if you could get to notice a higher level of detail. The ultra-wide camera also has a high-resolution sensor, and it would also allow us to extract a photo or crop to improve our framing, still maintaining a good quality in terms of resolution. And as I was already telling you, also the telephoto camera comes with this high-resolution sensor technology, although obviously it will also depend on what area you are focusing on. You will probably notice that there are some areas that are a bit out of focus. But if you get to have a good level of detail trying to crop out some areas. But I would like to have a little more precise focus. For moving pictures, we have good quality, both with the ultra-wide camera and with the main camera, and also with the telephoto camera. So honestly, I think it's a good device for taking pictures. In these tricky scenarios where there's movement, there are just some times that it might take a little bit longer to expose some areas correctly. They could be overexposed. But it will depend on the lighting conditions. We are also looking at the pictures in automatic mode. Now let's try to notice details in the automatic mode photography. Here we have the ultra-wide camera, which seems to me to have a considerably good lens. You don't get to notice significant distortions at the edges, so the quality of the photograph seems to me to be fine as with the main camera, which remember it's a 35mm, so it might look like it's already got a little bit of zoom compared to the captures you normally do with other smartphones. The telephoto camera is also going to offer us a good quality. Although in this case I see a little more distortion or a little blur on one of the edges, but honestly it seems to me a good quality of photography. Note how it even allows you to zoom in even further, although it starts to reveal a bit of chromatic aberration that could be annoying for the most demanding photographers. But note how even as we zoom in even further, it still retains a very good level of detail, and the maximum zoom it allows is about 1000mm. Obviously fully digital, and in fact here you start to see even the pixels, so it does not seem to me a spectacular zoom in terms of range, but at the previous levels I think it still managed to maintain a good quality of photography. Indoors, it also does a good job reducing noise well, maintaining good color saturation, so in this case I was surprised by the photo quality achieved both with the ultra-wide camera and with the main camera. Undoubtedly, it has an excellent performance, and even applying enough zoom considering that it uses the telephoto camera, we will notice a very good quality. In backlit conditions, note how the preview is not optimized, so some areas may look overexposed, but after taking the picture, it balances perfectly lights and shadows. It also maintains a more or less adequate representation of colors, although I feel that in this automatic mode, the colors can become a little more saturated than normal, so it will also depend on you as a photographer what color rendition you prefer. But note how with the ultra-wide camera, it also maintains a good balance of highlights and shadows, and even using the periscope camera, we have an excellent level of detail and what I like most, excellent balance of highlights and shadows. It's just that the colors look even more saturated than they should. Although remember that since the device has raw shooting capabilities, you might have your own interpretation of the colors. Here you're looking at a photograph in auto mode, and now we're looking at the same photograph but captured in raw, in this case with manual settings, so you can more or less tell the difference in how you might get to interpret the colors and lighting of your photograph exactly in the style you want. And for example, in this kind of super complicated lighting scenarios with aggressive backlighting, notice how raw photography would improve quite a bit the shadow area and even the highlight area more or less. Although also in auto mode, the Nubia Z Ultra's camera could try to make this balance with multiple exposure. So I think it's a good tool, although it's up to you which tool you should use. I think more experienced photographers could exploit these functions to the fullest, especially taking pictures in RAW, having the knowledge of what is the perfect setting for this kind of complicated scenarios. At night, we have a good result in this kind of conditions. Notice how both the dark areas come out well defined and without noise, and the illuminated areas come out well exposed, although revealing a little chromatic aberration. But with night mode, notice that there is not so much difference. Maybe the dark areas manage to gain slightly more illumination, but honestly there doesn't seem to be an abysmal difference. With the ultra-wide camera we will notice a practically equal result, and this is something I like because usually the ultra-wide camera has a much worse behavior in night photography, but in this Nubia Z Ultra we have an excellent result. Even using the night mode, as I told you, the darker areas get to gain slightly more illumination, but definitely the result is very good. Even also with the zoom camera, we will have an excellent result. Notice how perfectly balanced it is in this area where there was a lot of illumination, and the darker areas still show an excellent level of detail. Even notice the texture of the wall. The truth is that I find it an excellent photograph. Although again, even using night mode, it looks very similar. However, in the darker areas, notice that I found the color rendition to be exaggeratedly saturated, although this is within the automatic mode. I repeat, if you take the picture in RAW, maybe you can have a more accurate color development, because definitely the interpretation given by the automatic mode is too saturated and yellowish. Also, in this case, when you're in an extremely dark situation, it's not going to use the zoom camera unless you tell it to, and watch how much better the result is. And since we're taking pictures at night, notice how in this case, if you try to shoot something with the moon, it will just show a circle like it normally does on other cameras. But this device has a moon mode that allows you to capture this photograph with artificial intelligence, and notice how it would be able to mount more or less a similar moon to have a slightly attractive result. Although I think if it looks artificial, it doesn't look as natural a result. But hey, in some scenarios, it could look appealing to people, especially when there is a full moon. But in darker scenes is where we will be able to notice the capability of this camera. Notice how in this preview, it's a very dark result. But after taking the picture, I honestly find the level of detail it's capable of achieving in these kinds of practically twilight conditions to be super advanced. Even if you use the night mode, it manages to capture even more light, although it can lose a bit of detail level due to the long exposure. But the ultra-wide camera also has this kind of behavior, and with night mode, it is exactly the same as what we saw with the main camera. That is, you can lose a little bit of detail due to long exposure unless you use a tripod. In that case, you could have a much more accurate exposure. And with zoom shots, you'll notice that it doesn't use the telephoto camera but only uses the digital zoom. And when you use the night mode, it even gets worse. For macro shots, note that you can use the ultra-wide camera that has autofocus to get the most details of small objects, and the result is extremely good. Although you could also use the main camera, but it doesn't allow you to get as close. However, it does create a very nice blur effect in the background, and you could also try to apply a little bit of digital zoom if you want the subject to come out a little bit closer, and we still get good quality. So macro photography seems to me to be perfectly well covered by this device as well, showing good versatility in its photographic system. And if the ultra-wide camera's range still seems too limited to you, remember that you can take panoramic shots with both the ultra-wide camera and the main camera. So you can get very wide shots, and they maintain a good level of detail as well. So these are high-resolution panoramic photos. And finally, look at the quality of the portrait shots. In this case, with the 35mm lens, we have good quality, good for ground detection, although not 100% accurate. Especially in the more detailed areas, you might notice a bit of inaccuracy. But honestly, I think it's a good picture, maybe a little exaggerated blur. Although obviously if you start zooming in, the blur is naturally more intense and the result will look more attractive. What I like is that it also keeps the foreground objects in focus. Although I insist the accuracy of edge detection could be improved, but overall I think it does make for an attractive photograph. Even portrait photography with 85mm is also going to give us excellent quality. I really like the photography in this case because the level of detail is even greater. The blur looks very nice, although in this case it was unfortunately not as accurate with respect to the objects in the foreground. I would have loved to see a little more precision in this aspect, because otherwise I really like the portrait. In video recording, we will also find very attractive things. Note that it is capable of recording video in 8K, although only with the 35mm camera, which would be the main camera. But the fact that it allows you to record in this resolution is obviously already something very advanced. But notice that if you want to record in 4K, you can record in both 30 and 60 and up to 120 frames per second, even with the 3 lenses. This is something incredible. We definitely haven't seen a device with these same capabilities. So video recording is very appealing because of the resolution support that it has. You can even activate the pre-mode so that the camera has some time recording before you press the button so you don't miss the exact moment. It's something that can be very useful. And if you record in 4K at 60 frames per second, there is also the option to enhance the stabilization with 2 different levels. And when you start recording the video, you're going to be able to have control over the flashlight. And something I like is that you can even control its intensity, and that is something that few devices offer you today. Also, it has the option to take a picture while you are recording, pause and resume your content, and we can also manipulate the zoom. But unfortunately, it doesn't switch between its 3 lenses, and that will be its weakest point. Because even though in photography you can enjoy multiple focal lengths, while you are recording video, this is not the case. You have to stop recording, and then you can switch between any of these lenses. In fact, notice how even when recording in full HD at 30 frames per second, it is not able to give us dynamic switching between lenses. Therefore, it is confirmed that video recording has as its weakest point the fact of being fixed on one lens. Fortunately, in this case, also in expert mode, video recording is available, which comes in handy to have multiple parameters. Although in this case the shutter speed is limited to 1/30 seconds, which for video is the maximum it can be. But in ISO you can go up to the same 25,600 that we saw in photography. The video recording is definitely good as well. I feel like the colors have a good saturation, a good level of detail as well. Here the flaw is that if you start recording with the ultra-wide camera, it does allow you to zoom in, but it's not going to switch to the main camera, so you lose a lot of range. You have to stop recording and start it again from the main camera if you want to get a closer shot, but again it won't let you switch to the ultra wide camera, and if you want to zoom in a little bit it won't switch to the telephoto camera either, and that again limits you a lot in the zoom range. Notice how now we start the recording from the periscope camera, and in this case we have a better level of detail, so you could have an excellent zoom. Let's say that in range it does have a good quality, but it doesn't have a good range because you need to stop and restart the recording. One thing I like about this device is that it has the ability to record even up to 8K, so you could crop your video while maintaining good quality and detail. Obviously not all videos should be recorded in this resolution, but only when necessary. But those who get to produce some video will know the usefulness of this recording in 8K. And another remarkable thing is that you can record at 120 frames per second using the 4K resolution, so you could have a sort of slow motion in post-production in a cinematic way. I honestly love the result. In this respect, it is one of the best devices out there. Notice how you can have multiple clips recorded at 120 frames per second. And I repeat, the remarkable thing is that you can have this recording speed in 4K, since most devices can get to offer this speed, but only in full HD. Indoors, we will notice a good recording quality with the ultra-wide camera, although we do notice some noise, but it seems to hide it in a good way, especially considering that we are talking about the ultra-wide camera, which generally has a lower performance in this type of conditions. The main camera is going to perform similarly, albeit with even better handling for noise. But I like that in both cases we see good color saturation and good contrast, things that can get lost in other devices in these types of conditions. Even recording with the periscope camera we have good quality, although in this case noise can become much more visible and contrast is reduced, so this camera specifically does not perform as well when recording indoors. And in backlighting, note that with the ultra-wide camera we have an excellent balance of highlights and shadows, although the focus could struggle a bit. It is positive that it has autofocus in the ultra-wide camera, although I insist that in these scenarios could become slightly unstable, but nothing serious. In fact, with the main camera, note how we have this same drawback. The focus could be a little shaky, but honestly I find the balance of light and shadow very good. There is no overexposed area, no aggressive jumps in exposure. The shadow area is slightly darker than I would like, but still a positive result. With the periscope camera, maybe that's where we're going to underperform, because the shadow area will appear very dark, and again the focus could become a bit more inaccurate at times, but I honestly think the work that Nubia does on this device is very good. And notice that it also has an HDR mode for video recording, and I think it does improve the lighting and the shadows considerably. It seems like it's able to light better, but we're also going to start seeing more aggressive jumps in exposure, which we hadn't seen in auto mode. But testing the focus further, notice that with the ultra-wide camera, we are going to get to notice a considerably good performance. In this case, we are in a much nicer light condition and the focus definitely holds well, especially on a person or a face. Even with small objects, remember that the ultra-wide camera can get to focus, and it seems to me that it does so with good quality, obviously at the right distance. So the defocusing behaves fast and accurate enough. With the main camera, again, we will have a very similar result. In fact, with this camera, you get a more intense blur effect because of the nature of the lens compared to the ultra-wide camera. So you might even give yourself an effect similar to what we find with the special portrait videos. And with respect to small objects, we're also going to have a pretty aggressive bokeh effect, and we have good speed in the focus reaction. And finally, with the periscope camera, we have very similar performance. So if you're in good light conditions, the focus will have good quality, but if you're backlit, as we were seeing, it can get a little bit more confused. Although this, obviously, they can correct this with updates, fortunately. And the periscope camera might struggle a bit more trying to focus on small objects because it can't focus from a close distance. So it will not be so recommended to record with this camera this kind of scenes. Recording at night, we confirmed that the ultra-wide camera performs well, especially compared to other devices. Obviously, it will not be as capable of balancing lights and shadows well, but we would demand that from much more expensive devices. What I like about this device is that even in the darkest scenes, it manages to recover a very good amount of light, although the white balance might start to get a bit confused. So it would be best to shoot with a fixed white balance to get better quality in this video. If we switch to the main camera, we're gonna notice good quality as well. Again, it doesn't quite balance highlights and shadows, but at night this is a much more complex activity. Something I also like in the recording of this device is that it controls noise well, and unlike photography, the colors seem to me to retain a good accuracy. Obviously, in darker areas, it can suffer a bit more than I would like, and if there are some reflections affecting the lens, it could generate some pink areas in the darker areas. Finally, if you shoot with the periscope camera, in these types of scenes, it might suffer a little bit more in terms of its focus. Obviously, if you go to the darker scenes, you'll confirm that it's a camera that doesn't have as much light input, so you'll lose a little bit of contrast and you'll start to get a lot more noise present and poor definition. So this camera is not as recommended for recording at night, but the main and ultra-wide camera is. Note that the ultra-wide camera has a standard stabilization. When walking and when running, you can feel a lot of footsteps. So the experience is not so pleasant because even the focus can struggle. With the main camera, I think you get a better understanding of this movement when walking and even when running. Obviously, with the periscope camera, it is a more difficult activity, but in this case, it does not integrate a special stabilization mode for the periscope camera, although we will have it in a general way, and it applies to the ultra-wide camera. However, even with this super stable mode enabled, I don't feel that it gives us a very high quality scene because the steps feel very marked and it doesn't quite disguise the vibration. And this recording, by the way, is at 60 frames per second in full HD. Interestingly, the device also incorporates a portrait recording mode, although I had already anticipated that if you record with the main camera, generates a totally natural bokeh effect that is very nice. So I don't see this as useful because even if it doesn't detect your face, it's going to completely disable the blur, and it's not able to increase or decrease the intensity of the blur depending on how far away you are. So definitely this portrait recording mode is not very useful. I would prefer to record with the main camera with a completely natural effect, as you'll even notice that even though it does manage to keep objects in focus a bit, it's not as accurate as we'd like it to be. It even lets us record with a portrait effect using the periscope camera, in this case in full HD at 30 frames per second, just like the clip above. But again, I think it's not as accurate, and having such good capabilities with the 35mm camera, I think it would be more advisable to record with that camera compared to what it can offer us in this special mode that uses artificial intelligence. The device also has fast camera that can be in 4K but has no stabilization, and also goes to a bit rate that is not very high, so the level of detail that you get to appreciate is not so good. Also, the slowest is 15x, so it may be too fast for people, but the fastest may be 1800x, so you can record even plant growth or natural scenes much more attractive. Slow motion looks great at 240 frames per second with full HD resolution. That will be the most recommended setting as it maintains a good balance between level of detail and slowness. Although the device can go up to 480 frames per second with what you have even more slowness, giving a more spectacular result in this regard, but it drops to HD only. So the result looks very pixelated and therefore it is not so recommended. But if you are going to make a publication on social networks where the video will go down in resolution anyway, it can be useful for more creative and attractive scenes. The front camera will definitely have a very simple video quality, it has no stabilization, and being behind the screen will produce an effect as if the camera was stained. It does not have a good exposure because at times overexposes some areas, and obviously backlit will not be able to balance lights and shadows, well, in addition to the ghost effect that is generated on the edges of the objects. So it is definitely a very simple camera that is not recommended for recording, plus the resolution is full HD at 30 frames per second. In interiors, this camera is also going to suffer too much. It has very low light input. There is too much noise in the scene with very little detail and very little contrast, confirming that it is a very bad camera for this type of application. And at night, this is confirmed because there is a lot of noise present and little definition. Again, it feels like the camera is tainted, so it's definitely a very bad experience recording with this front camera, just like it was in photography. It will not be recommended at all. Also, with the front camera, we are not going to have fast or slow motion, but it does have a portrait recording mode with what blurs the background, although the truth, due to the simple and very altered colors that captures this camera, the result again is pretty bad, and I definitely did not like it. What I did like and can be useful in certain scenarios is the dual camera mode, as it does allow you to record with both the front camera and the rear camera. Plus, you can move the picture-in-picture mode box, and you can also swap these cameras. So in that sense, the experience will be good. You can also switch to a split-screen view, but you can't vary the zoom, which would give you much more versatility. So to switch between cameras, you have to stop the recording and start it again. So you don't have as much versatility in zooming as we had seen from the main recording, and in this case the results are in full HD, something that is positive, but we would like even more if it was a result in 4K. In software, this device arrives with Android 14 and running on the iOS 14, which is the version of this customization layer of ZTE, because as you know, ZTE owns Nubia and owner of Red Magic, so surely they will share several things. As you notice, in this case I'm getting an update, so even though it doesn't have a set policy for updates, at least it looks like they will indeed send some updates to optimize the system. Although I would definitely like it much better if they would confirm a good number of updates for this device. Regarding additional features, I think there will be a good presence of them. For example, we are going to find the possibility to customize a bit more, for example, the home screen icons, or also the same shape of icons and other tools that usually come on various Android devices. But in this case, it also allows you to change the animation speed to have a much more fluid experience, and also has some additional visual effects, for example, for call notifications, which as you will notice can give an interesting touch to your device. It also integrates the always on screen options, which can also show you a cover with the clock and some notifications. The lock screen, as you will notice, will constantly change the background. This is one of the features that usually come with ZTE devices. And if you swipe, you can also keep changing the images. In this case, there are images of nature, unlike in other versions where suddenly you get quite strange images. So, it can help you too. As you can see here, you can enter to select the images you want to appear, or you can also add your own images. As you can see, it also integrates a sidebar called Z Smart, from which you can open applications in a floating window mode. Only in this case, you can only open one application at a time. So it's not that useful, but it does allow you to resize or reposition these small windows. It would be much better if it allowed us to open several windows of this style at the same time. You should also know that Instagram is not supported, although YouTube is. Also, in the list of recent apps, we could choose that we want a split screen, which could be useful since you could get to have up to 3 apps open at the same time, considering the floating window. And although by default the switch on the side opens the camera, you could also tell it to open the game space so that it has a very similar behavior to what we see in Red Magic, or you could also set it to turn on the flashlight, which would be very handy. If that's more your thing, check it out. It's a pretty cool option because the switch has a rough feel to it, and it's going to be a lot easier to activate these options without having to turn to look at the phone. You could also open the voice recorder or change the sound mode in the purest iPhone switch style to be in silent mode or normal mode. So it's up to you how you want to configure this switch. The one-handed use mode it integrates is in true iPhone style, i.e. it simply flips down the screen, unlike other options that reduce it by a proportional size. So as you can tell, it's a considerably good operating system. I like it in the sense that in the purest style of Samsung's One UI, it allows you to pull down some lists so that they are at your fingertips and you don't need to go all the way to the top of the screen. That's something we don't usually see in other systems, but this one is quite convenient. Lastly, you should know that the optical drive is on the x-axis, so it produces a very premium vibration feel, but it's not as optimized in the system, so you won't feel some bouncing or some interactions with the system with sliders and more. In that sense, it still feels like the operating system could mature to take more advantage of the optical engine and give you a more premium experience. This device integrates fingerprint reader inside the display, and it's an optical reader, so it's not ultra fast, but it can give you a functional treatment to register up to 5 fingerprints. In this case, it's also going to have some other options to take advantage of, such as quick launch of apps. So you can create a menu so that if you hold down your finger on this part, it also opens up this quick menu and you can create shortcuts to apps. Interestingly, it also has facial recognition, although it is only in 2 dimensions. As the camera is under the screen, I doubt very much that it has accuracy, so it is not so recommended. We will also find the extended unlock in this part, a bit hidden, but it would allow you to keep your cell phone unlocked in trusted environments. The password manager on this device is from Google, although it doesn't seem to work very well. As you notice, there are some fields where it doesn't give you the suggestion, but at least it does check your fingerprint first before filling in. However, the all optimal. Inside the file manager, we are going to notice that we can save all kinds of documents, but we have a section called privacy that allows us to also store in this app called My Vault apps, images, videos, even passwords. Or you could also access it directly with the My Vault app. So it's kind of a secure folder that works well. Although it doesn't have child mode, it doesn't have app locking, it doesn't have an advanced malware scanner or anything like that. What you will find is an application duplicator to have 2 accounts on the same device in case you need it. And if you happen to lose your phone, you depend on Google's own implementation since Nubia doesn't have its own. So, in this part, always make sure that the setting is turned on, and also remember that you have the digital wellness settings to see the consumption you have in each application and be able to set limits and manage your children's devices. And by pressing the on-off button 5 times, you can initiate an emergency call. The battery of this device is 6000 milliamps, and although it may seem like a very large battery, I must say that in this case it did not perform as well as expected. Since you already have it very clear, I run several drain tests. So the first test was to run this drainer in the foreground, and it reached 3 hours and 30 minutes. So as you realize, when you push it to the max, the battery seems to drain with a lot of speed, and even running this app in the background while watching videos. It came in at 4 hours and 18 minutes. So it doesn't honestly seem like a very remarkable battery performance to me. It could be improved with better management of background apps, and possibly this battery is split in two to be able to charge so fast, but that's not officially confirmed. Obviously, if you want to extend your battery life, I would think that enabling the saver mode should improve considerably, and you also have Ultra Saver mode available for emergency occasions. But while the battery doesn't really stand out despite having a large capacity, what does stand out too much is the charging. This charger is 80 watts and is included in the box, and despite being such a large battery, it recovers energy very quickly. With 15 minutes of charging, it got up to 47%. With 30 minutes, it got up to 81%, and it finished charging in no more than 41 minutes. So it charges really very fast as long as you have the turbocharge option enabled. Consider it, because otherwise it's not going to charge that fast. Obviously it doesn't have wireless charging or reversible wireless charging, but these are things that we could ask from more expensive devices. And with respect to battery care, we only find the option of charge separation, which will make the energy pass directly from the charger to the device without passing through the battery. And this would allow the device not to heat up so much while you are playing. But this just prevents overheating and maybe allows you to play for a long time without you being worried about the battery. But it's not really a battery care feature like smart charging or charge lock that we see on other devices. In connectivity, it integrates pretty much everything we could ask for. It has support for 5G networks, although in this case apparently does not include a data blocking mode to select which network you want applications to connect to the internet. For Bluetooth, we find the 5.3 version, and it also has NFC, so you can enable mobile payments and that sort of thing. It will not have FM radio, but it does come with OTG, like virtually all devices today. Even through this port, you can connect an HDMI adapter, and it will be able to do its wired screen projection. Something that in this price range is practically impossible to find, so this could be one of the advantages. But if you want to project the screen wirelessly, you could also do it through Z Smartcast, which curiously inherits many functions from Red Magic. So, in addition to projecting the screen in a mirrored fashion, you could project your game and hold a gamepad on the cell phone, or you could also project directly onto a computer. So, it has good projection options, both wired and wireless. It is also going to integrate Android Auto for easy connectivity, and in the sensor section we will find everything we need, including a geomagnetic field sensor, also a good gyroscope, and curiously the proximity sensor is physical, unlike other devices that are betting on virtual sensors. So sincerely that in sensors there is not a single complaint. Regarding the ecosystem, there is little we can mention since Nubia is part of the entire ZTE family, and as you know, they do not have a large ecosystem interaction, although they have some proposals for tablets. They are actually experimental tablets, for example their Nubia Pad, which has a screen on the display, but they don't really have any smartwatch, any wristband, or anything that makes a much more advanced interaction. So it's a pretty short ecosystem that mostly relies on Google and their own technologies. So fortunately, being Android, you also have an open ecosystem. For example, you have Quick Share, so you can share files with other devices, and you also have Google Fast Pay. So even headphones from other brands that integrate this same Google Fast Pay technology could be quickly detected for a little bit easier connection. These kinds of ecosystem issues, as I told you, will work under Google technologies. In the same way, it depends on Google for cloud storage, since they do not have their own cloud, and for control of home devices, they also depend on Google. Although in this case, they do not include the Google Home application pre-installed, so the button to access home controls is disabled until you install Google Home. Let's talk about performance because it has a fully flagship processor. It's the Snapdragon 8 Gen 3, a processor that we usually only see in more expensive devices. That's why it stands out so much, and in this sense, I think it won't have any competitor in this price range. On average, it has taken time to open every app showing full muscle. There is definitely no other device in this price range that is going to give you this smooth performance. Notice how browsing within the apps you are also going to have an excellent experience without a doubt. So it is a very advanced device that will give you a totally high performance. I have no doubt about it. This processor is usually integrated, as I say, in much more expensive devices. It also has 16 gigabytes of RAM in its highest edition, although the most basic version has 8 gigabytes of RAM, but it still allows you to enable extended RAM of up to another 12 gigabytes. In this case, notice that the RAM also seems to be perfectly well managed, so running multiple applications at the same time is going to be entirely possible. Notice how we didn't notice any restarts in any application, so definitely the experience is totally good. In this case, I have the 512 gigabyte version, which would also be highly recommended because you would have so much capacity to store files and all kinds of documents. But remember, the base version is 256. It's still a good capacity, but consider that it doesn't have the possibility of putting a micro SD on it. So I think it would be best to buy the 512 gigabyte edition. Now let's do a test by exporting a video, joining several clips recorded with this device in 4K, but you should know that CapCut compressed these videos. Even though we told it that we didn't want to compress, it compressed them anyway, and that will make this export process probably much faster, even though we're going to put it at 4K 30 frames per second. So let's test how long it's going to take with this setting. And that's it. It would be 11 seconds, being an exaggeratedly fast export process, but I insist that the videos were compressed. So to make a fairer test, I will use a paid editor, which is much better because it does not compress the videos. So again, it's a 4K video with a total duration of 1 minute, and let's see how long it takes to export in 4K at 30 frames per second. That's it. 21 seconds, still a spectacular time, so it's one of the best devices for exporting video. Let's talk about games, but curiously there is no games application to open it and have more options. The only way to open it curiously is to reconfigure the slide button, which would be quite strange. So in this sense it could and should be improved. Notice how we are now going to be able to access the game space, which is practically inherited from Red Magic. So we will find a huge suite of options, and this could also prove to be a strong attraction for those who like to play games. Notice how we can also customize the touch setting of the screen and even the high performance mode that we can select, and many other things more. So it really is a super advanced suite of options. It even has a monitor of the frames per second and all the power consumption as well. And notice how it has the whole Red Magic suite of options. So it's practically a Red Magic in this sense. And if you don't know Red Magic, well, it has a tremendous suite of options that would take me another half hour to count. But among the most outstanding ones, I could mention a site that can be totally fixed, as you see in this case in the center of the screen. In this case, I can enable or disable it. And you could also create macros or reassign the keys. If a button is too far away, you can move it even if the game does not allow it. And in this case, you can change the phone's quick settings and also open applications in a floating mode. So honestly, in this sense, we could also say that it's a phone for gamers, practically transferring the whole Red Magic experience to a Nubia device, with the only difference being that it won't have a fan, and that may cause the device to not be able to cool itself to the same level as a Red Magic. But definitely through software, the experience is pretty much the same. In Call of Duty, the device gives us the very high quality at maximum frame rate by default, but it also lets us go up to maximum graphics quality, which is very remarkable because so far it's the only device we've seen that gives us this quality available. We can also upload at an ultra rate, but the graphic quality is decreased. However, I repeat, the graphics compatibility that this device is capable of offering is extremely advanced, and that is not a device focused on gaming, but it will definitely give you an excellent experience for graphics compatibility and also for the tremendous fluidity that will be able to achieve. Even with the ultra setting of frames per second, the device maintains excellent compatibility with effects in this game. So first we did the test on a maximum rate, and definitely the performance is brutal. Even without having a fan, it manages to achieve performance with excellent fluidity. Even the temperature doesn't get to rise drastically, and look at those graphical effects that we have when we enable the crosshairs. Definitely give us an experience that so far I had not seen in another device, and all this without raising the temperature too much. Honestly, that for this price I do not know if you're going to find something better. And consider that in this case also comes with a very good photographic system, unlike other devices that tend to focus a lot on gaming, completely abandoning the cameras. And with the ultra rate, note that it is indeed capable of reaching up to 90 frames per second. Although in this case it had a little bit of a low peak, but most of the time it's very close to 90 frames per second. So it has a very good level of stability. Only in this case, as a fun fact, in the settings you have to select that you want the ability to go up to 120 frames per second, because otherwise it will be stuck at 60. However, definitely the experience when playing with this setting is excellent. You even still get good graphical effects, as I mentioned, so I don't think there's going to be a device that's going to give you superior performance at this price point, even again, without overheating. In the Legends game, we changed the automatic setting to the Ultra setting at 60 frames per second, although I should tell you that this setting is aimed at much more expensive devices. But since we saw excellent performance in Call of Duty, we chose this setting. And again, the performance was excellent, only a small low peak at the beginning of the game, which almost always happens in this content. But other than that, the experience was extremely good. Virtually no hitches, although obviously some not very noticeable ones. But definitely, the gameplay on this device will be very good. In fact, the only thing missing to make it a red magic would be its triggers. And the fan, obviously, that I mentioned to you, but it doesn't get to be missed because in this case it got up to 41 degrees Celsius. So it handles the heat very well. So that's why I tell you the only thing you would miss about a red magic would be pretty much the triggers. In the SpongeBob game, by default we have high resolution and high quality at 60 frames per second. We're going to put it up to epic, although this would not be recommended in this price range. But since it's giving a brutal performance, let's put it to a tricky test. And in this case, again, it maintains a lot of fluidity. A low peak of 36, but in this case we must remember that in this section of the game is quite complicated. Without recording the screen, we see a very good performance, although recording the screen can have some much more visible stumbles, so perhaps here you can get to notice more the absence of a higher level of cooling, although still the device did not get to warm up, but perhaps it has a special management to not heat up so much, slightly limiting the power of the processor. Even so, I insist the gamer experience is extremely good despite the fact that recording the screen may be a little too complicated. And finally, in Henshin Impact, by default, this device will give us the medium quality, but for the test we raised it to the highest just to see what it was capable of, although I insist that this graphics configuration is not recommended for this price range. But look at the tremendous performance we got! Practically 100% stability, even with all these visual effects. And notice how it didn't even get above 45 degrees Celsius, which would be a level that we would already consider annoying. So definitely that the experience was very good. In this case, the so-called Diablo mode was activated in this game, which pushes the processor to the limit. So that's probably why it had this perfect stability, sacrificing a little bit of warm-up, but again, not exceeding 45 degrees Celsius. I think the performance was very good. Even the funny thing is that it had better temperature performance than what we saw on the Red Magic Pro, which even has the same processor and fan. So it's curious how, in this case, we were able to have superior performance. Definitely, for gamers, it is a supreme experience. And if you are a gamer who does not want to sacrifice quality in cameras, I think this alternative is one of the most attractive. So, in conclusion, we could say that it is a device that you will enjoy a lot if you like photography and gaming at the same time. Probably its weakest point will be the front camera, which is a real shame. But in the rest of the sections, it gets to stand out a lot, or in some other things, it feels like a well-balanced device. So I have no doubt that it is a very good recommendation to buy. For the moment, we have reached the end of this video. If you liked it, you know you can point it out. And we'll see you next time.